What if the reason you feel lost right now is not because you haven't found enough, but because you've been searching too much? From the moment you were old enough to understand the world, you were taught a quiet assumption that something was missing, that somewhere out there beyond your current life there was a better version of everything, a better version of you, a better version of reality. And so without even realizing it, you began to move, to chase, to reach for something just beyond the horizon, believing that one day, if you just pushed a little harder, achieved a little more, figured things out a little deeper, you would finally arrive at a place where everything made sense, where the emptiness disappeared, where life felt complete. But here's the strange part: no matter how far you've come, no matter how much you've achieved or experienced, there's still this subtle feeling, almost impossible to explain, like something is just out of reach, like you're getting closer but never quite there. And maybe you've told yourself that it just means you need to keep going, keep improving, keep searching, because that's what everyone says, that's what success looks like, that's what growth is supposed to be. But what if that very instinct, the need to constantly seek, is the thing keeping you stuck in the same invisible loop? Because the moment you begin to search for something, you unconsciously create the idea that you don't already have it, and that single assumption, that quiet belief of lack, begins to shape everything you experience. It influences the way you see your life, the way you interpret your progress, even the way you feel about yourself. And without noticing it, you become someone who is always almost there, always on the edge of something better, but never fully inside it. And it goes deeper than that, because the more you chase, the more your mind reinforces the distance between you and what you want, turning life into a constant pursuit instead of a lived experience. And maybe you've felt this in moments when everything slows down unexpectedly, when you stop trying even just for a second, and there's this strange sense of peace, like nothing is missing at all, like everything is already here. But then the mind jumps back in, telling you to keep going, keep searching, keep striving, and the silence disappears, replaced again by the pressure to become, to achieve, to find. But what if that brief moment of stillness wasn't an accident? What if it was a glimpse into something real, something deeper than everything you've been chasing? Because what if the truth is not that you need more, but that you've been looking in the wrong direction this entire time, and the deeper you look into this pattern, the more unsettling it becomes, because it means that the feeling of something missing was never coming from your life itself, but from the way you were taught to relate to it. A subtle conditioning that begins early and grows stronger over time, where every achievement is followed by the next goal, every milestone quickly replaced by another destination, creating the illusion that fulfillment is always one step ahead, never here, never now, always somewhere else. And this is where most people get trapped without ever realizing it, because the system feels normal, it feels logical, it feels like progress, but underneath it there is a quiet tension, a constant sense of not enough. And maybe you have felt it in those moments when you finally reach something you once wanted so badly, only to notice that the satisfaction fades faster than you expected, leaving behind the same question: what is next? What else is out there? What am I still missing? And that question becomes the engine of your life, pushing you forward but never allowing you to arrive. But it goes deeper than that, because the act of seeking does not just influence your actions, it shapes your identity. You begin to see yourself as someone incomplete, someone in progress, someone who needs to become something else in order to feel whole. And once that identity takes hold, every experience you have is filtered through it. Every success feels temporary. Every failure feels like proof that you are not there yet. And reality begins to mirror that state back to you, reinforcing the cycle in ways that feel almost invisible. And this is why the more you chase clarity, the more confused you can feel. The more you chase happiness, the more it seems to slip away. Not because these things do not exist, but because the very energy of chasing creates distance. And here is the part most people miss: it is not about what you are chasing, it is about the state from which you are chasing it. Because if you move through life from a place of lack, even abundance will feel incomplete. And if you move from a place of fullness, even the simplest moments begin to feel meaningful. And maybe you have already experienced glimpses of this without fully understanding it. Times when you were not trying to prove anything, not trying to get anywhere, not trying to become someone else. And yet everything felt lighter, clearer, more alive, as if life was not something to be pursued but something that was already unfolding around you and within you. But the mind resists this idea because it cannot control it, it cannot measure it, it cannot turn it into a goal, so it pulls you back into the familiar pattern of seeking, of analyzing, of trying to figure it all out. But what if the more you try to figure out life, the further you move away from actually experiencing it? And what if the constant search for meaning is the very thing that hides it from you? And if you follow this even further, you begin to notice something that changes everything, a quiet shift in perspective that most people overlook, because it does not come from effort, it comes from awareness, the realization that the moment you stop chasing, you are not losing anything, you are actually stepping out of the illusion that something was ever missing in the first place. And this is where the paradox becomes real, not just an idea, because when the movement of seeking slows down, something else begins to emerge, something that was always there but constantly covered by noise, by effort, by the endless pressure to become, and it feels unfamiliar at first, almost uncomfortable, because you are so used to measuring your life by progress, by direction, by what is next, that the absence of that movement can feel like emptiness, like nothing is happening. But here is the deeper truth, that emptiness is not a void of lack. It is a space of clarity, a space where the constant tension of trying begins to dissolve, and in that space you start to notice things you have been missing all along. The simplicity of being present, the quiet intelligence of life unfolding without your control, the subtle sense that everything you were searching for is not something to be achieved, but something to be recognized. And maybe you have touched this state before without naming it, in moments when time seemed to slow down, when you were not thinking about the past or the future, not trying to fix or improve anything, just fully here. And in those moments there was nothing to chase, nothing to prove, and yet everything felt complete. But then the mind returns, pulling you back into the familiar pattern, asking, what does this mean? How do I keep this? How do I turn this into something permanent? And without realizing it, the seeking begins again, trying to capture what can only be experienced when you are not trying to capture anything at all. And this is where most people get lost, not because they are doing something wrong, but because they are trying too hard to do something right, turning even peace into another goal, another destination, another thing to pursue. But peace is not something you arrive at through effort. It is what remains when effort falls away. And the more you begin to see this, the more you understand that life is not responding to your attempts to control it. It is responding to your state of being, to the energy behind your actions, to whether you are moving from lack or from wholeness. And when that shift begins to happen, even in small ways, everything starts to feel different, not because the world has changed, but because you are no longer relating to it in the same way. And this is where a subtle but powerful shift begins to take place, one that most people never fully recognize because it does not look dramatic from the outside. It does not come with a sudden breakthrough or a clear milestone. It feels almost invisible, like something quietly rearranging itself beneath the surface of your awareness. Because when you stop relating to life as something you need to chase, you begin to experience it as something that is already happening, already unfolding. And this changes the way you move through even the simplest moments, because now you are not constantly measuring where you are against where you think you should be. You are not comparing your present to some imagined future that always seems better. Instead, you begin to notice what is actually here, what is actually real. And it may sound simple, but it goes deeper than most people realize, because the mind has been trained to overlook the present in favor of what comes next, always projecting forward, always searching for something more, something different, something better. And in doing so, it creates a kind of blindness to what already exists, a blindness that keeps you from seeing the fullness of your current experience. And this is why even when everything seems fine on the surface, there can still be a sense of restlessness, a subtle dissatisfaction that never fully goes away. Because the mind is not designed to rest in what is, it is designed to seek what is not. But here is the turning point, the moment you begin to see that pattern clearly, not as an idea but as something happening within you, you gain a kind of freedom from it, not by force, not by trying to stop it, but by no longer believing everything it tells you. And in that space something new begins to emerge. Different way of experiencing life that is not driven by lack, not fueled by the need to become, but rooted in a quiet sense of completeness that does not depend on circumstances. And maybe you have already sensed this in fleeting moments, when you are fully engaged in something, when you lose track of time, when there is no past or future, no pressure to be anywhere else, just a deep connection to what is happening right now. And in those moments there is no search, no distance, no gap between you and life. There is only experience, direct and immediate, and this is what most people overlook, not because it is hidden, but because it is too simple for the mind to value, too present to be noticed by a mind that is always looking somewhere else. But once you begin to recognize this, even briefly, it starts to change everything, because you realize that what you have been chasing is not something you need to find. It is something you need to stop overlooking. And the more you see this, the less urgency there is to search, the less pressure there is to figure everything out. And in that absence of pressure, life begins to feel different, not because it has changed, but because you are no longer running from it. And as this awareness deepens, something even more unexpected begins to happen, not in the world around you, but in the way you experience yourself within it, because for the first time you start to see that the pressure you have been carrying was never coming from life itself. It was coming from the constant resistance to what is, the quiet belief that this moment is not enough, that this version of you is not enough, that something must change before you can finally feel at peace. And, without realizing it, that belief has been shaping every decision, every reaction, every interpretation of your reality, creating a subtle tension that follows you everywhere, even into moments that should feel complete. But here is where it shifts, because the moment you stop fighting your current experience, even slightly, the energy that was once used to resist begins to dissolve. And in its place there is a sense of openness, a space that was always there but constantly filled with noise. And in that space you begin to notice something important, that life is not something you need to fix before you can live it. It is something you are already inside of, already participating in, whether you are aware of it or not. And this realization does not come as a dramatic revelation. It comes quietly, almost like remembering something you always knew but forgot. And maybe you feel it now, not as a thought, but as a subtle shift in how you are listening, how you are perceiving this moment. Because when you are not trying to get somewhere else, even for a few seconds, there is a kind of stillness that appears. And in that stillness there is no problem to solve, no gap to close, no version of yourself to chase. There is only what is happening right now. And for most people this feels unfamiliar, even uncomfortable, because it removes the structure they have relied on for so long, the constant movement, the constant striving, the constant sense of direction. But what if that discomfort is not a sign that something is wrong, but a sign that something false is beginning to fall away? Because when the identity of being someone who is always searching starts to loosen, you are left with something much more real, something that does not need to prove itself, something that does not depend on external validation or future outcomes. And this is where a deeper sense of stability begins to form, not the kind that comes from controlling your environment, but the kind that comes from no longer needing to. And as this becomes more familiar, you begin to trust it, not as an idea but as a direct experience, a knowing that does not require explanation. And from this place your actions begin to change naturally, not because you are forcing yourself to be different, but because you are no longer acting from the same sense of lack. And when that happens, life starts to respond in ways that feel almost effortless, not because everything suddenly becomes perfect, but because you are no longer creating resistance against what is already here. And then something even more subtle begins to reveal itself, something that most people overlook because it does not fit into the way they have been taught to understand progress. Because you start to notice that when you are no longer chasing, your actions do not stop, your life does not freeze. In fact, it begins to move in a different way, a way that feels less forced and more natural, as if you are no longer pushing life forward but allowing it to unfold through you. And this is where many people get confused, because they believe that if they stop seeking they will lose motivation, that without the pressure to become something more they will fall behind, become stagnant or lose direction. But what if that fear itself is part of the illusion? Because what actually happens is the opposite. When you are not driven by lack, your actions are no longer reactions to fear or insufficiency. They become expressions of clarity, expressions of what naturally wants to move through you. And this creates a completely different experience of doing, where effort still exists but it no longer feels heavy, where movement still happens but it is not driven by anxiety about the future. And maybe you have experienced this in moments where you were fully immersed in something you genuinely enjoyed, where time seemed to disappear and your actions felt almost automatic, not because you were trying harder, but because you were no longer divided inside. There was no part of you resisting, no part of you questioning whether you were enough. There was just action flowing from a place of alignment. And this is the key difference that most people miss. It is not about stopping action. It is about transforming the state from which action comes. Because when action comes from lack, it reinforces the feeling that something is missing. But when it comes from wholeness, it reinforces the experience that nothing is lacking. And this begins to reshape how you interact with everything in your life, your work, your relationships, your goals, because you are no longer using them as a means to complete yourself. You are engaging with them as an extension of a completeness that is already there. And this shift may seem small on the surface, but it changes everything beneath it, because now success does not define you, failure does not diminish you, outcomes do not control your sense of self. And in that freedom you become more present, more aware, more responsive to what is actually happening instead of what you think should be happening. And from this place something remarkable begins to occur. Opportunities appear differently, decisions become clearer, interactions feel more genuine. Not because the external world has changed, but because you are no longer projecting the same sense of lack onto it. And this is where life starts to feel less like a problem to solve and more like an experience to participate in. And the more you stay with this, the more natural it becomes, until one day you realize that the constant urge to search has quietly faded, replaced by something far more stable, a sense of being that does not depend on getting anywhere else. And yet, even as this new way of experiencing life begins to stabilize, there is still one layer that quietly pulls most people back into the old pattern. A layer so subtle that it often goes unnoticed, and that is the habit of interpreting every feeling, every moment, every experience through the lens of meaning, constantly asking, what does this mean for me? Where is this leading? Is this enough? Am I doing it right? And this mental habit seems harmless on the surface, but it is one of the deepest roots of the cycle of seeking, because the moment you try to assign meaning to everything, you step out of direct experience and into analysis, and in that shift the mind begins to recreate the distance that was just dissolving, because instead of being fully present with what is happening, you are now evaluating it, measuring it, comparing it to an imagined standard, and this brings back the subtle tension, the quiet sense that something is still not quite right, that something still needs to be figured out. But here is what most people never see. Meaning is not something you find at the end of a search. It is something that emerges naturally when you are fully engaged with life itself, without resistance, without constant interpretation. And maybe you have felt this in moments where you were so present that you were not thinking about meaning at all, and yet everything felt meaningful, not because you analyzed it, but because you were completely there, fully connected. And in those moments there was no question of whether your life had purpose, because the experience itself was enough. But the mind struggles with this because it wants certainty, it wants structure, it wants a clear explanation it can hold on to, and so it pulls you back into questioning, into searching, into trying to define something that can only be felt. And this is where the loop quietly begins again, not through big actions, but through small internal movements, the need to understand, the need to confirm, the need to label what is happening. And while these may seem like steps toward clarity, they often create more distance instead, because they replace direct experience with conceptual thinking, and the more you rely on that, the less connected you feel to what is actually here. And this is why even after moments of deep clarity, people often find themselves returning to confusion. Not because the clarity was lost, but because the mind re-entered and began searching for it again, turning something simple into something complex, something immediate into something distant. But what if the clarity was never meant to be held onto, never meant to be turned into an answer, but simply experienced again and again in each moment you stop searching for it? And what if the more you try to define your life, the more you move away from actually living it? And this is where the final illusion begins to dissolve, not through effort, not through trying to understand more, but through a quiet recognition that there was never anything to solve in the first place, because the moment you stop trying to extract meaning from every experience, something unexpected begins to reveal itself, a kind of intelligence within life that does not need your constant interpretation, a natural flow that has been there all along, quietly guiding, adjusting, unfolding without needing to be controlled or fully understood. And at first this can feel unsettling, because it challenges everything you have been taught about how life is supposed to work, that you must always be in control, always moving forward, always figuring things out. But what if that need for control is what has been creating the feeling of disconnection all along? Because when you try to control every outcome, every direction, every meaning, you place yourself in opposition to the natural movement of life, creating resistance where there could be flow, tension where there could be ease. And the more you begin to see this, not as an abstract idea but as something happening within your own experience, the more you start to trust something deeper than your thoughts, something that does not speak in words but in a quiet sense of knowing, a sense that you are already exactly where you need to be, even if your mind cannot explain why. And maybe you have felt this in moments where things seemed uncertain on the surface, but internally there was a calmness, a subtle clarity that did not depend on having all the answers. And in those moments you were not searching, not questioning, not trying to define your path, and yet everything felt aligned in a way that is difficult to describe, because alignment is not something you think your way into, it is something you return to when you stop interfering with what is already happening. And this is where life begins to feel less like a puzzle and more like a process, something you are part of rather than something you must solve. And as this becomes more familiar, the need to constantly evaluate your life begins to fade, replaced by a deeper presence that allows you to experience things as they are, without immediately turning them into something else. And in that presence there is a kind of freedom that does not come from changing your circumstances, but from no longer needing them to be different in order to feel complete. And this is the point where the search quietly ends, not because you found something new, but because you finally stopped overlooking what was always here. And as this realization settles deeper within you, something even more profound begins to unfold. A shift not just in how you experience moments, but in how you understand your entire life, because you start to see that what you once called purpose, direction, or meaning was never something fixed waiting for you in the future. It was something fluid, something alive, something that reveals itself only when you are fully present with what is already here. And this changes the question entirely. because instead of asking where am I going or what should I become, you begin to sense a different kind of inquiry emerging, one that is quieter, less urgent, but far more real. What is life expressing through me right now? And this question does not create pressure, it creates openness. It invites you into participation rather than pursuit, and in that shift you begin to feel less like someone trying to control the path and more like someone moving with it, responding to what is in front of you instead of constantly reaching for what is not. And maybe you have already experienced moments where everything seemed to fall into place without effort, conversations that unfolded naturally, decisions that felt clear without overthinking, opportunities that appeared at the right time without forcing them. And in those moments there was no sense of chasing, no sense of lack, only a quiet alignment between your internal state and your external experience. But what most people do is they try to recreate those moments, to figure out how they happened, to turn them into a method, and in doing so they unknowingly return to the same pattern of seeking, trying to control something that only appears when control is not present. But what if those moments were not random? What if they were reflections of a deeper truth? That when you are not divided inside, when you are not resisting or searching, life begins to organize itself in ways that feel almost effortless, not because everything is perfect, but because you are no longer creating friction against it. And this is where trust begins to replace effort, not blind trust, but a grounded sense that you do not need to have everything figured out in order to move forward. That clarity does not come from thinking more, but from being more present. And as this trust grows, you begin to notice that your relationship with uncertainty changes. It no longer feels like something to fear or avoid. It becomes part of the experience, something that adds depth rather than confusion. And in that space you are free to move, to act, to create, without the constant need to justify or predict every outcome. And this is where life begins to feel different at its core, not as a problem to solve or a destination to reach, but as a living process that you are already part of. And the more you allow yourself to stay with this, the more natural it becomes, until one day you realize that the search that once defined your life has quietly dissolved, replaced by something far more stable, a sense of being that does not depend on what happens next. And yet even here, at this point where the search begins to fade and a deeper sense of presence starts to stabilize, there is still one final layer that quietly holds people back, a layer so familiar that it often feels like truth itself, and that is the belief that life must look a certain way in order to be valid, that your experience must match some external standard before it can be considered meaningful, successful, or complete. And this belief does not always appear as something obvious. It hides in subtle comparisons, in the way you look at others and measure your progress against theirs, in the way you question whether you are doing enough, becoming enough, achieving enough, and without noticing it, this creates a quiet pressure that pulls you back into the old pattern, because now even your presence becomes something to evaluate, something to get right, something to perfect. But here is the deeper realization: life was never asking you to meet a standard. It was never asking you to become a specific version of yourself in order to be worthy of experiencing it fully. Those standards were learned, absorbed over time through culture, expectations, and conditioning, and while they may guide certain aspects of your actions, they do not define the essence of your experience. And the moment you begin to see this clearly, something begins to loosen, because you no longer feel the need to constantly compare your life to an imagined ideal. You no longer feel the need to validate your existence through external measures. And in that space there is a kind of freedom that cannot be achieved through effort, because it does not come from adding anything new, it comes from releasing what was never truly yours. And maybe you can feel the shift even now, the difference between trying to become someone and simply being who you already are, not as a fixed identity but as a living, changing experience that does not need to fit into a predefined mold. And as this becomes more natural, your relationship with yourself begins to change in a fundamental way. You are no longer an object to improve or fix. You are no longer a project to complete. You become something else entirely, a space in which life unfolds, a presence that experiences without constantly judging, without constantly measuring. And from this place your actions still continue, your life still moves forward, but it is no longer driven by the need to prove something. It is driven by a quiet alignment with what feels true in each moment. And this is where a deeper sense of peace begins to take root, not the kind that depends on everything going your way, but the kind that remains even when things are uncertain, even when life does not match your expectations, because you are no longer relying on external conditions to define your internal state. And in that realization something becomes clear, that what you were searching for was never waiting at the end of a path. It was always present in the way you experience each step along it. And then there is a moment that cannot be forced, a moment that does not arrive through effort or understanding, but through a quiet surrender that happens when you finally stop trying to hold everything together. And it is subtle at first, almost unnoticeable, like a soft shift in the background of your awareness, because for so long you have been carrying the weight of needing to make sense of your life, needing to direct it, shape it, control where it is going and what it means, and even when you begin to let go of chasing, there is still this underlying tension, this need to ensure that you are on the right path, that things are unfolding correctly. But here is where it changes in a way that most people never expect, because you begin to see that even the idea of a right path was part of the illusion, a concept created by the mind to maintain a sense of control, and when that begins to dissolve, something else becomes visible, something that was always there but hidden beneath layers of expectation. And that is the realization that life is not something that needs to be directed in the way you once believed. It is something that is already moving, already evolving, already unfolding with or without your constant intervention. And this does not mean you become passive or disconnected. It means you begin to participate differently, not as someone trying to force outcomes, but as someone who is deeply attuned to what is happening, responding instead of reacting, allowing instead of resisting. And in this shift there is a sense of relief that goes beyond words, because you are no longer carrying the burden of needing to figure everything out. You are no longer trying to predict every step or guarantee every result. And in that absence of pressure, clarity begins to appear in a way that feels almost effortless, not because you searched for it, but because you stopped blocking it. And maybe you can recognize this in moments where the answer to something came when you were not thinking about it, when you were relaxed, when you were not trying to solve anything, and suddenly there it was, simple, obvious, clear. And this is not coincidence. It is the natural result of a mind that is no longer crowded by constant seeking. And as you begin to trust this more deeply, something within you stabilizes, not as a belief, but as a direct experience, a knowing that you do not need to chase life in order to live it fully, that you do not need to constantly search in order to find what matters, because what matters has never been separate from you. It has always been here, waiting not to be discovered, but to be recognized. And in that recognition, something inside you becomes still, not empty, but complete in a way that does not depend on anything outside of this moment. And as this sense of completeness becomes more familiar, something quietly begins to reorganize within you, not in a way that demands attention, but in a way that subtly transforms how you move through every part of your life, because you are no longer operating from the same foundation. You are no longer driven by the need to become someone else or to reach a point where everything finally makes sense. Instead, there is a shift toward simply being with what is, and from that place a different kind of intelligence begins to guide your actions, one that does not rely on constant thinking or analysis, but on a deeper awareness that feels immediate and clear. And this is where life starts to feel less like something you are trying to figure out and more like something you are directly experiencing, moment by moment, without the need to label or define it. And it may seem almost too simple, almost too obvious, but that is exactly why it is so often overlooked, because the mind has been trained to look for complexity, to believe that something meaningful must also be difficult to understand. But what if the most important aspects of your life were never meant to be complicated? What if they were always available in the simplicity of your direct experience, in the way you feel, in the way you notice, in the way you engage with what is right in front of you? And as this becomes clearer, the need to constantly interpret your life begins to fade, replaced by a more direct connection to it. And from this connection a different kind of action emerges, one that is not driven by fear or lack, but by a natural sense of movement that does not need to be justified or explained. And this changes how you approach everything, because you are no longer trying to use your life as a means to achieve something else. You are engaging with it as something that is already whole, already complete in each moment. And in that shift there is a quiet confidence that begins to grow, not the kind that comes from certainty about the future, but the kind that comes from being fully present in the now and trusting that whatever unfolds will meet you where you are. And maybe you can feel this even now, a subtle difference in how you relate to your own experience, less tension, less urgency, less need to figure everything out, and more openness, more clarity, more presence. And in that presence there is a kind of depth that cannot be explained, only experienced, a sense that life is not something you need to chase or understand completely, but something you are already part of, already within. And the more you allow yourself to stay here without rushing away, without turning it into another goal, the more natural it becomes, until eventually it is no longer something you practice. It is simply the way you are, and in the end, what remains is not a final answer, not a perfect understanding, not a completed version of yourself, but something far more real, something that cannot be taken away or improved because it was never lacking to begin with, a quiet awareness that you are already within the very thing you have been searching for. that life was never separate from you, never waiting somewhere else, never hidden behind some future version of who you could become. And this realization does not arrive as a dramatic conclusion. It settles in slowly, like a truth that feels both new and strangely familiar at the same time, because deep down you have always sensed it, in those moments when everything became still, when the noise of the mind faded just enough for you to feel what is actually here. And in those moments there was nothing to chase, nothing to fix, nothing to understand, only a direct experience of being alive, complete in itself. And this is where the illusion fully dissolves, not because you figured it out, but because you stopped creating the distance that made it seem like something needed to be found. And as this becomes clearer, something inside you shifts permanently, not in a way that makes life perfect, but in a way that changes how you relate to everything that happens, because you are no longer looking for life to give you something it was never withholding. You are no longer trying to extract meaning from every moment or force it to match your expectations. Instead you begin to meet life as it is, without resistance, without the constant need to turn it into something else. And from this place there is a quiet strength that emerges, a sense of stability that does not depend on circumstances, a presence that remains even when things are uncertain or unpredictable. And this is where a deeper freedom begins, not the freedom of having everything go your way, but the freedom of no longer needing it to. And as you continue to live from this space, something becomes undeniable, that what you once thought was missing was never missing at all. It was simply overlooked, hidden in plain sight by the habit of searching. And now that the search has fallen away, even if only for a moment, you can see it clearly, feel it directly, not as an idea but as your own experience. And in that experience there is nothing left to become, nothing left to prove, only the unfolding of life as it is, through you, as you, in a way that no longer needs to be chased, because it was always here waiting to be lived. What if the moment you stopped searching, even just for a second, was not emptiness, but the first time you actually touched what you've been looking for all along? And if something in this made you pause, even slightly, I'm curious, have you ever experienced a moment where everything felt complete without needing anything more? Even if it only lasted a few seconds, because those moments might mean more than you think, so share it below. And if you feel like you're starting to see life a little differently now, stay here, because this is only the beginning of what you're about to understand.